Well, the pandemic has upended life for millions of Canadians, but new research says women, particularly mothers, are bearing the brunt of the economic damage. An alarming number of them are being pushed out of the workforce, either laid off or having to quit to homeschool and look after their children. Sylvia Fuller is a professor of sociology at the University of British Columbia. She's been studying the issue and says governments must do more to help working moms. And she joins us right now in Vancouver. So Sylvia, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So you've been looking at this issue. Take us through the research, what you're finding here, and how mothers are being hit hardest by the economic impacts of COVID-19.
Well, in a nutshell, we did find that the pandemic was really impacting mothers' employment much harder than it was impacting fathers. So what we did was we looked at parents who had been employed in the past year, and we compared mothers' and fathers' employment rates each month from the end of February, so that's before the pandemic really hit, to the end of May when the economy was just starting to open back up. That was the most recent data that we had available. Now, at the end of February, there wasn't much of a gap, just about a percentage point. And remember, we're focusing here on parents who were largely employed, so that's not surprising. But by the end of May, that had opened to 2.5 percentage points for parents of preschoolers and 7 percentage points for parents with kids 6 to 12. So gender inequality was actually growing more for parents with elementary school kids than for those with little kids. And the other thing we found was that the gender gap was really growing a lot more for parents with the least amount of education. So for parents with a high school education or less, the gender gap in employment among those with school-age kids, elementary school, grew more than 10 times to 17 percentage points by the end of May, and that is really huge.
So mothers being hit harder than fathers out of your data, also mothers who have a high school education or less being hit harder than women with a university education?
That's right, absolutely.
And any reasons behind that when you look at those numbers?
Well, there's a couple of things going on. So one is if we think about the kinds of jobs that folks are working in, those jobs that particularly are likely to have mothers working in them with low levels of education, think retail, restaurants, sort of front-end customer service jobs, those are really hit hard by the pandemic. So a lot of those jobs went away and people lost their jobs. The other thing to think about is that some folks have more flexibility in their work than others. So again, if you think about the kinds of jobs that women with less education tend to hold, these aren't jobs that you can work from home. These aren't jobs where you have a lot of flexibility in the hours that you work. You can't just bring your child with you if you're a cashier at the superstore, right? So if somebody has to be around to take care of these kids that aren't old enough to take care of themselves, and there's no childcare available, and there's no schooling available, and you don't have flexibility in your work, well, when push comes to shove, more often it's going to be the moms who are going to be having to do that. So we have the nature of the jobs, and then we also have those gender norms that tend to push mothers more than fathers to see themselves as responsible for that work.
So as you look at these numbers then, what do you fear is the long-term damage of having so many women having to leave the workforce?
Well, it's important to remember that we're looking at the worst case scenario here. So we're looking at people who actually lost their jobs, not people who had to reduce their hours of work, not people who were maybe working from home or having to take a leave from work. So this is losing your job. And we know that folks who lose their jobs, when they get back into the labor force, they often don't find jobs that are as good as the ones that they had before. So if mothers are disproportionately losing their jobs and having to find new jobs, that can impact gender wage gaps going forward. We also know that, and this speaks a little bit to kind of discrimination against mothers in the labor force, that when mothers tend to earn less than women without children. And part of the reason for that is that when mothers are on the labor market looking for a new job, they're more likely to be reemployed in jobs that tend to pay everybody less. And so again, if you have this sort of generation of mothers who are actually losing their jobs and having to go back onto the labor market when things do pick up and those jobs are there again, they're going to be at a disadvantage. So you can really have long-term impacts on gender wage gaps, for example, even when people end up reemployed after the pandemic is over.
So where does government policy fit in then in terms of a way to look forward, and in particular childcare? Because as we're having this conversation, of course, ringing in my ear is that long-held argument that women's equality will never be achieved without universal childcare.
And there is tons of evidence on this, that having affordable, accessible childcare really does make a difference for all kinds of equality indicators for women's employment, whether that's wages, whether that's the likelihood of being employed, working full-time, all those kinds of things. But I think that what the pandemic has really shown us, too, is that we have to think not just about childcare in the short term, at least for little kids, and that's critical and important, and that has to be there. But also we have to think about all these kids who are going to be going back to school in some form in the fall. What is going to happen to them if that school isn't in person full time? Because school is school, but it's also childcare. And if we're just expecting parents to somehow on their own make plans, pick up the slack, figure out what they're going to do if their kids aren't in school full time, I really fear that we're going to see even greater growth in that inequality. Because while parents might have been able to manage this for the short term, when they're just thinking, okay, it's a couple months we need to get through, we'll manage it when school's back, and it starts to stretch out for month after month after month, I fear that you're going to have a lot more families who are in that position where they're having to make a choice about who is going to have to step back from their job, or employers who get, tired of not being able to manage their employees not being available full time and giving them the boot, whether they're allowed to do that or not with employment standards. Those are the kinds of things that happen. So it really does have a negative consequence. And governments need to be responsible for thinking about how are we going to care for those kids if the schools aren't in full time. You can't just leave it to parents.
Sylvia Fuller, thank you.
Thank you.